And what shocked me most wasn't just the violence, it was how incredibly close rival territories often existed to one another. At first, I assumed there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe one large gang controlled the city while smaller groups fought underneath it. I couldn't have been more wrong. The reality was far more complicated, and once I understood it, I realized why Chicago has remained one of the most misunderstood cities in America. What I discovered completely changed the way I looked at every headline. Before we go any further, I need to make one thing clear. This isn't about glorifying gangs. It isn't about celebrating violence. It's about understanding how decades of history, poverty, politics, housing policies, and fractured alliances created a maze that even longtime residents sometimes struggle to explain. Because without understanding the map, none of the violence makes sense, and that's where my journey began. I started with history. Long before social media documented neighborhood conflicts, long before drill music brought international attention to Chicago's streets, organized gangs had already established themselves across different parts of the city. Some groups formed for protection, others emerged from ethnic tensions, neighborhood rivalries, or economic hardship. Over time, many of them evolved into powerful organizations with structured leadership, defined territories, and complex alliances. But even that picture wouldn't stay the same forever. As decades passed, leadership changed, old alliances fractured, federal prosecutions dismantled major organizations, younger generations no longer followed centralized commands. Instead, many neighborhoods became controlled by much smaller factions, each defending only a handful of blocks. That was the first major surprise. When people hear the word gang, they often imagine thousands of members acting under one unified command. In many parts of Chicago today, the reality is very different. Some neighborhood crews control only a few streets. Others have split from larger organizations after personal disputes or neighborhood conflicts. Former allies sometimes become bitter enemies. Long-standing rivals occasionally cooperate against a common threat. The map constantly shifts, and that's exactly what makes understanding Chicago so difficult. Then I noticed another pattern: railroad tracks, expressways, rivers, public housing demolitions, school boundaries. They weren't just landmarks. Again and again, they appeared to shape territorial lines, influencing where rival groups operated and where conflicts were most likely to emerge. I couldn't stop asking myself one question: how could neighborhoods separated by only a few minutes on foot become worlds apart in terms of loyalty and danger? The answer wasn't sitting on the surface. It was buried beneath decades of history. Every block carried stories passed from one generation to the next, stories of retaliation, stories of loss, stories of families who never wanted any part of the violence but found themselves living inside it anyway. And as I continued tracing neighborhood after neighborhood across Chicago's South Side, West Side, and other areas, one realization became impossible to ignore. The map wasn't simply showing geography. It was showing relationships. Broken relationships. Changing relationships. And sometimes relationships that could turn deadly over a single misunderstanding. The more neighborhoods I examined, the more complicated everything became. Some rival territories shared the same street. Others were separated by nothing more than an alley. There were places where crossing a single intersection could mean entering an entirely different world. That raised another question I couldn't ignore. If the boundaries were this close, how did ordinary residents navigate everyday life? How did children travel to school? How did families visit relatives? How did businesses survive surrounded by rival territories? I kept searching for answers, but every answer uncovered an even larger mystery. Then I came across something that completely changed the way I understood Chicago's gang map. It wasn't a neighborhood, It wasn't a gang. It was a single decision made decades earlier, one that quietly reshaped entire communities and influenced conflicts that still echo today. The deeper I dug into that history, the more I realized the map was telling a story that most people had never heard. That discovery kept pulling me deeper. I found myself staring at old city maps for hours, comparing neighborhoods from different decades. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Streets were still where they had always been. Parks hadn't moved. The lake still stretched along the eastern edge of the city. But entire communities had changed in ways that weren't obvious until I looked closer. One neighborhood that had once been home to thousands of families looked completely different just a generation later. Public housing towers that had dominated the skyline were gone. In their place were empty lots, new developments, or scattered housing projects miles away. That wasn't just an architectural change, it was a population shift. And when thousands of people were relocated into neighborhoods that already had established identities, existing rivalries didn't disappear. In many cases, they collided. The more I studied those movements, the more I realized the map wasn't being redrawn by cartographers. It was being redrawn by people. Families trying to rebuild their lives, teenagers searching for belonging, communities adapting to sudden change. Some neighborhoods absorbed newcomers peacefully. Others struggled under the pressure. Old disputes followed people into new streets, while fresh conflicts emerged between groups forced to share spaces they had never shared before. I kept asking myself whether there had ever been a moment when everything could have gone differently. There wasn't a simple answer. Because Chicago's story wasn't shaped by one event. It was shaped by decades of decisions, each building on the last. Economic decline closed factories that had once employed entire neighborhoods. Opportunities disappeared faster than new ones appeared. Vacant buildings multiplied. Investment moved elsewhere. For many communities, the feeling of being left behind became impossible to ignore. That environment didn't create every conflict, but it made many of them harder to escape. Then another pattern emerged. The old gang structures that had once operated with centralized leadership gradually weakened. Federal investigations, long prison sentences, internal disagreements, and changing generations fractured organizations that had once stretched across large portions of the city. What replaced them surprised me. Instead of a few massive organizations controlling broad territories, many neighborhoods became dominated by smaller, independent sets. Some identified with larger historical alliances, but their day-to-day decisions were often made locally. That meant personal disputes could escalate much faster. A disagreement between a handful of individuals no longer had to pass through layers of leadership. Retaliation could happen almost immediately, creating cycles that spread from one block to the next. As I traced those neighborhood boundaries, I noticed something unsettling. Many rival territories weren't separated by miles. Sometimes they were separated by a single street. In some places, walking less than 2 minutes could take someone from one territory into another. To an outsider, nothing looked different. The houses looked the same. The sidewalks looked the same. Cars passed by without revealing the invisible lines that residents often knew by heart. That invisible geography fascinated me. How could 2 blocks that looked nearly identical carry completely different meanings? The answer wasn't written on street signs. It lived in memory. Every neighborhood carried stories passed from older generations to younger ones. Stories of friendships that had fallen apart. Stories of loved ones who never came home. Stories that shaped how entire communities viewed the blocks around them. Then I came across another layer I hadn't expected. Social media. Years ago, neighborhood rivalries spread mostly through face-to-face encounters. But technology changed that dynamic. Arguments that might once have stayed local could now unfold in front of thousands of people. Insults traveled instantly. Videos circulated within minutes. Tensions that had once remained confined to a few streets could intensify far more quickly. That didn't mean every online conflict became real-world violence. Far from it. But it added another dimension to an already complicated landscape. As I continued mapping neighborhoods, I realized something else. The vast majority of Chicago residents were simply trying to live ordinary lives. Parents walked children to school, workers boarded trains before sunrise, local businesses opened their doors every morning, community leaders organized youth programs, churches welcomed families every weekend. These stories rarely made national headlines, yet they existed alongside the conflicts that dominated the news. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The same city that produced heartbreaking violence also produced extraordinary resilience. And somehow, both realities occupied the same map. But there was still one question I couldn't answer. If so many neighborhood rivalries had evolved over decades, why did some of them become far more intense than others? I thought I was close to understanding it. Then I uncovered a chain of events involving shifting alliances, personal loyalties, and neighborhood divisions that made the map even more complicated than I had imagined. The moment I connected those pieces together, I realized I had only been looking at the surface. The more I connected those pieces, the more I realized this wasn't a puzzle with missing parts. It was a puzzle that never stopped changing. Every time I thought I finally understood the map, another neighborhood revealed a history that challenged everything I believed. A set that had once been closely aligned with another suddenly became its fiercest rival. A conflict that outsiders assumed was decades old had actually begun with a much more recent disagreement. The deeper I dug, the more I understood that loyalty in Chicago's streets wasn't frozen in time. It evolved, sometimes overnight. That realization forced me to stop looking at gangs as fixed organizations on a map. Instead, I began looking at people, young people. Many of them had grown up surrounded by stories they never chose. They inherited neighborhood identities long before they understood what those identities meant. The block where they were born often shaped how others saw them before they ever had the chance to define themselves. I couldn't ignore how heavy that burden must have been. Imagine growing up where your address carried assumptions, where crossing into another neighborhood wasn't just taking a shortcut, it could be interpreted as something entirely different. For many residents, daily life continued as normal. They worked, raised families, and looked after their neighbors. Yet even ordinary routines sometimes required an awareness that visitors never had to think about. That invisible pressure stayed with me. Then I started reading first-hand accounts from community organizers, violence interrupters, and former gang members who had dedicated their lives to preventing retaliation. Their stories weren't filled with dramatic victories. More often, they described exhausting conversations, late-night phone calls, and desperate attempts to convince someone not to make a decision they could never take back. One conversation, one rumor, one misunderstanding. Sometimes that was all it took to change multiple lives forever. And yet, those same conversations occasionally prevented violence that no headline would ever report. That struck me harder than anything else. The events we never hear about may be just as important as the ones that dominate the news. As I continued tracing neighborhood histories, another uncomfortable truth emerged. Not every conflict had a clear beginning anymore. Some rivalries had continued for so many years that the original cause had faded into memory. Younger generations sometimes knew who they were expected to oppose without fully understanding why the hostility had started in the first place. That cycle fascinated me, but it also unsettled me. How do you end a conflict when its origins have become blurred by time? The answer wasn't obvious. Then I looked beyond the streets themselves. I began examining schools, employment opportunities, community investment, and local organizations working to create alternatives. Suddenly, the map looked different again. Instead of only seeing boundaries between rival neighborhoods, I started noticing bridges, youth centers, after-school programs, mentorship initiatives, violence prevention groups, small businesses trying to keep entire blocks alive, people who refuse to accept that their communities would always be defined by tragedy. Those places rarely appeared in documentaries or viral clips, but they existed, quietly, persistently, every single day. Still, the challenges remained enormous. For every success story, there were families grieving unimaginable losses, empty chairs at dinner tables, birthdays that would never be celebrated together again, streets where memorials served as painful reminders of lives cut short. The emotional weight of those stories stayed with me long after I finished studying the maps, because eventually I realized something that statistics could never capture. Every dot on a crime map represented a human life. Every line separating neighborhoods represented relationships, histories, and decisions made over generations. And every headline that reduced Chicago to a stereotype overlooked millions of residents who wanted nothing more than safe streets, stable communities, and better opportunities for their children. The more I learned, the less interested I became in asking which neighborhood was stronger or which group controlled more territory. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. What would it actually take for those invisible lines to begin disappearing? That question led me away from the maps and into the stories of people who had spent years trying to rewrite the future instead of repeating the past. What I discovered next was the first genuine sign that this long, complicated story might not be destined to end the way so many expected, but I still didn't know whether those efforts would be enough. I didn't know whether those efforts would be enough. The more people I listened to, the more I realized there wasn't going to be a single moment where everything suddenly made sense. There wasn't one meeting, one policy, or one arrest that could erase decades of history. The map I had spent so much time studying hadn't been created overnight, and it wasn't going to disappear overnight either. But something had changed. Not on the map, in the way I understood it. I began speaking with people whose names rarely appeared in national headlines, teachers who stayed long after school had ended because they knew some students were safer inside the building than outside, community volunteers who walked neighborhoods every evening, not because they were paid to, but because they refused to let fear define the streets they called home. I learned about violence interrupters who stepped between conflicts before they escalated, often risking their own safety in the process. They weren't superheroes. They weren't perfect, but they believed that one conversation at the right moment could save a life. Sometimes it did. Those stories rarely became viral news. A shooting prevented doesn't generate the same attention as a shooting that happens. A teenager choosing a different path rarely becomes a headline. A neighborhood gathering to reclaim a park doesn't spread across social media with the same speed as another tragedy. Yet those moments matter. In fact, they may matter the most. As I looked back over everything I had learned, I realized how easy it is to reduce an entire city to a single narrative. One dramatic headline, one shocking statistic, one viral video. But Chicago has never been just one story. It is a city of millions of people. Millions of different lives. Millions of different experiences. Yes, there are neighborhoods that have endured heartbreaking cycles of violence. Families who have suffered losses that no community should ever have to bear. Streets where the pain of the past is still visible in memorials, empty homes, and memories that refuse to fade. Those realities deserve to be acknowledged honestly, but they are not the whole picture. The same city has produced world-class artists, entrepreneurs, athletes, educators, scientists, and community leaders. It is home to neighborhoods filled with culture, resilience, history, and people working every day to build something better than what they inherited. That was the biggest lesson the map taught me. Maps show where things are. They don't always explain why they're there. A boundary on a screen can't tell me about the grandmother raising her grandchildren after unimaginable loss. It can't show the coach who opens a gym every afternoon so teenagers have somewhere safe to spend their evenings. It can't capture the business owner who refuses to leave because they believe their neighborhood is worth fighting for, and it certainly can't measure hope. Hope doesn't appear in satellite images, it isn't outlined by streets or railroad tracks, it lives in people. The more I understood that, the less interested I became in asking who controlled which block. Instead, I found myself wondering how more blocks could become places where children felt free to play, where families could gather without fear, and where the next generation inherited opportunities instead of conflicts. That doesn't mean the challenges are gone. Far from it. The issues that have shaped parts of Chicago, economic inequality, housing, education, access to opportunity, and public safety, remain complex and deeply interconnected. No single documentary, map, or conversation can solve them. But understanding is always a better starting point than misunderstanding. Because when we replace assumptions with history, stereotypes with facts, and fear with context, we begin to see people instead of labels. I started this journey believing I was studying a gang map. I finished it realizing I had been studying something much larger. A story about neighborhoods. A story about generations. A story about choices made decades ago that still echo today. Most importantly, a story about ordinary people trying to build extraordinary lives despite circumstances they never chose. If there's one thing I'll carry with me after tracing every line, every boundary, and every neighborhood, it's this.